Imagine a world where the brightest minds are ignored simply because of their gender. A world where pioneers are hidden in the shadows of history, their contributions nearly erased. Now, what if I told you that the early space programs, the very missions that took humanity beyond Earth's atmosphere, were built on the brilliance of women? Women whose names you've likely never heard. The story of space exploration often begins with figures like Yuri Gagarin, Neil Armstrong, and John Glenn. But behind these iconic men were women who played crucial roles, calculating trajectories, engineering spacecraft, testing the limits of human endurance, and even training as astronauts themselves. Yet their achievements were downplayed, overlooked, or outright dismissed. This is the untold history of women in early space programs, a history of resilience, intellect, and an unyielding passion for the stars. To truly understand the depth of their contributions, we must go back to a time before the space age, before rockets pierced the sky, and before the dream of walking on the moon became a reality. The journey begins in the early 20th century, when women started making their mark in the field of aeronautics. During World War II, thousands of women stepped into roles traditionally held by men, working as engineers, mathematicians, and pilots. Among them was a group that would later prove indispensable to the space race, the female computers of the 1940s and 50s. Long before digital computers, human computers performed the complex calculations needed for aviation, and later, spaceflight. At institutions like the National Advisory Committee for Aeronautics, NACA, which later became NASA, women worked tirelessly to crunch numbers that would determine the success or failure of experimental aircraft. One of these women was Katherine Johnson, a mathematician whose calculations of orbital mechanics were critical to the first American spaceflights. But Johnson was not alone. Dorothy Vaughan and Mary Jackson, two other brilliant minds, also made significant contributions, ensuring that the data used in spaceflight was accurate and reliable. Despite their intelligence and dedication, these women faced constant barriers. They were paid less than their male counterparts, often denied access to high-level meetings, and expected to work quietly in the background while men took the credit. Yet, their work was so precise, so indispensable, that even astronauts began to trust them over the newly emerging digital computers. John Glenn, before his historic orbit around Earth, famously insisted that Katherine Johnson personally verify the machine's calculations, saying, "If she says they're good, then I'm ready to go." But women didn't just contribute from behind desks. They also pushed the limits of human endurance, proving that they, too, had the right to explore space. In the 1960s, a secretive program known as the Mercury 13 set out to test whether women could survive the rigors of space travel. Funded by Dr. William Randolph Lovelace, this privately run initiative put 13 female pilots through the same grueling tests as the male Mercury astronauts. These women, including Jerry Cobb, Wally Funk, and Rhea Waltman, underwent extreme physical and psychological examinations. They endured sensory deprivation, isolation, and rigorous physical stress tests, often outperforming the men. Yet despite their undeniable success, NASA and the U.S. government refused to let them fly. The official reasoning? There was no need for female astronauts, as no women were military test pilots, a requirement that NASA itself had set. The Mercury 13 were shut out of the program, their dreams of spaceflight crushed by institutional bias. When Jerry Cobb testified before Congress, arguing that women should have the chance to go to space, the response was dismissive. A few congressmen even mocked the idea, asking who would make dinner if women became astronauts. Meanwhile, on the other side of the world, the Soviet Union took a different approach. In 1963, Valentina Tereshkova became the first woman in space, orbiting Earth aboard Vostok 6. Unlike NASA, the Soviets saw propaganda value in showcasing gender equality, even if it was largely symbolic. Tereshkova's mission was a triumph, proving that women were just as capable of enduring the challenges of spaceflight. Yet after her historic flight, it would take nearly 2 decades before another woman, Svetlana Savitskaya, followed in her footsteps. Back in the United States, despite being shut out of astronaut training, women continued to shape the future of space exploration. Engineers like Margaret Hamilton revolutionized software development, creating the onboard navigation system for the Apollo missions. Without her groundbreaking work, Neil Armstrong and Buzz Aldrin might never have set foot on the moon. Her software was so reliable that when an overload error occurred during the Apollo 11 landing, her programming ensured that the computer prioritized critical tasks, allowing the mission to continue safely. The contributions of women extended beyond engineering and mathematics. Poppy Northcutt, a young engineer at NASA, became the first woman in mission control, working on the Apollo 8 mission to calculate return trajectories for astronauts traveling around the moon. Her presence in a room full of men was groundbreaking, yet she was often treated as an anomaly rather than an equal. Women like her had to constantly prove their worth, even when their work spoke for itself. Despite these challenges, the persistence of women in early space programs laid the foundation for future generations. The battles they fought against discrimination, exclusion, and systemic bias paved the way for the inclusion of women in later space missions. But their struggles were far from over. It would take until 1983 for Sally Ride to become the first American woman in space, and, even then, reporters asked her whether she would cry if things went wrong, or how she planned to do her makeup in zero gravity. The untold history of women in space is not just a story of exclusion, it's a story of resilience, brilliance, and an unwavering belief that the stars belong to everyone. Their names may not have been etched into the pages of history as prominently as their male counterparts, but their contributions are undeniable. As the space race intensified throughout the 1960s, the contributions of women remained largely behind the scenes, yet their work was indispensable. While the Mercury 13 women were denied the chance to fly, many of them refused to give up their dreams of advancing space exploration. Some continued pushing for greater opportunities in aviation and science, while others turned their attention to mentoring the next generation of women who aspired to work at NASA. Their determination set the stage for gradual, albeit slow, change. Meanwhile, women continued to serve as the backbone of NASA's calculations, engineering, and mission planning. One of the most influential figures during this time was Frances "Poppy" Northcutt. A young mathematician and engineer, Northcutt became the first woman to work in NASA's mission control during the Apollo program. At just 25 years old, she was responsible for designing return trajectories for the Apollo astronauts, a task that carried immense responsibility. During Apollo 8, the first mission to send humans around the moon, Northcutt's calculations ensured that the spacecraft could safely return to Earth. In an environment dominated by men, she proved that women were just as capable of handling the high-pressure demands of spaceflight operations. Yet, despite her expertise, Northcutt faced constant scrutiny. She was often treated as a curiosity rather than a respected engineer. News articles at the time focused more on her appearance than her groundbreaking work, highlighting what she wore rather than the complex calculations she performed. This reflected a broader societal issue. Women in technical fields were still seen as anomalies rather than equals. As NASA progressed toward its most ambitious goal, the Apollo 11 moon landing, another woman's work became crucial: Margaret Hamilton. As the lead software engineer for the Apollo program, Hamilton and her team at MIT developed the onboard flight software that allowed astronauts to navigate, land, and return safely. Her pioneering work in software engineering introduced concepts that would become standard in modern computing, including error detection and priority scheduling. One of the most remarkable moments proving the importance of Hamilton's work occurred during the Apollo 11 moon landing. Just minutes before touching down on the lunar surface, the spacecraft's computer began displaying alarm codes. The onboard system was overloaded, threatening to abort the mission. But thanks to Hamilton's programming, the system was designed to recognize and prioritize critical functions, allowing the astronauts to proceed with the landing. Without her software, Neil Armstrong and Buzz Aldrin might have had to abort their historic moonwalk. Despite her achievements, Hamilton's contributions were downplayed for decades. While male engineers and astronauts were celebrated as heroes, her work remained in the background. It wasn't until much later that she received the recognition she deserved, eventually being awarded the Presidential Medal of Freedom in 2016. While these women worked tirelessly behind the scenes, the fight for female astronauts was far from over. The Soviet Union had already sent Valentina Tereshkova into space in 1963, proving that women could endure the same physical and psychological rigors as men. But in the U.S., resistance remained strong. The argument that women weren't qualified because they weren't military test pilots continued to be used as an excuse for their exclusion. However, societal attitudes were beginning to shift. By the late 1960s and early 1970s, the women's rights movement was gaining momentum, pushing for equal opportunities in various fields, including space exploration. In 1972, Title IX was passed in the U.S., prohibiting gender discrimination in federally funded programs. This legislation would later open doors for women in STEM fields, including aerospace and astronaut training. At the same time, the political landscape was changing. The Apollo program was winding down, and NASA was looking ahead to the next era of space exploration. Plans for the Space Shuttle program were in development, and for the first time, there was real discussion about selecting a diverse astronaut corps. This shift would eventually lead to the selection of the first female American astronauts, but it would take nearly a decade before that became a reality. While progress was slow in the U.S., other countries were beginning to recognize the importance of women in space programs. In 1982, the Soviet Union sent Svetlana Savitskaya into space, making her the second woman to fly. 2 years later, she became the first woman to conduct a spacewalk. Her achievement was groundbreaking, yet it received far less attention than similar feats performed by her male counterparts. As NASA prepared for the space shuttle era, the fight for inclusion was far from over. Women had proven their capabilities, time and time again, whether through their engineering expertise, their mathematical brilliance, or their physical endurance. Yet, the road to becoming astronauts remained blocked. The early space programs had been built on their work, but they were still waiting for the opportunity to claim their rightful place among the stars. As NASA transitioned from the Apollo program to the space shuttle era, the door finally began to open for women in space. The years of advocacy, legal battles, and undeniable contributions by women in engineering and science had built momentum. By the late 1970s, societal attitudes were shifting, and the demand for gender equality in all fields, including space exploration, became too strong to ignore. In 1978, NASA announced a new class of astronauts that would be trained for the Space Shuttle program. For the first time, women were included. Among them was Sally Ride, a physicist and engineer who would go on to make history as the first American woman in space. But she wasn't alone. This group of trailblazers also included Judith Resnick, Anna Fisher, Catherine Sullivan, Rhea Seddon, and Shannon Lucid. Their selection marked a turning point, proving that women could finally be recognized not just as contributors to space exploration, but as astronauts themselves. However, even with this breakthrough, the challenges persisted. When Sally Ride was preparing for her historic flight aboard the Space Shuttle Challenger in 1983, the media's focus was less on her qualifications and more on outdated gender stereotypes. She was asked whether spaceflight would affect her reproductive system, whether she planned to wear makeup in space, and how she would handle emotions under pressure, questions that no male astronaut had ever faced. Despite this, she remained focused on her mission, knowing that she was paving the way for future generations of women. When Ride finally launched into space on June 18, 1983, she became a symbol of progress, not just for women in the U.S., but for aspiring female astronauts around the world. Her flight proved once and for all that women were just as capable as men in the harsh environment of space. Yet, even with this milestone, NASA remained far behind the Soviet Union in terms of female astronaut representation. By the time Ride flew, the Soviets had already sent 2 women into space, and their female cosmonauts had conducted spacewalks, something NASA wouldn't allow a woman to do until Catherine Sullivan performed the first American female spacewalk in 1984. While Ride broke barriers, Judith Resnick also made history. She became the second American woman in space and was known for her incredible intellect, having earned a PhD in electrical engineering. Tragically, Resnick was one of the 7 astronauts killed in the Challenger disaster in 1986. Her death was a devastating loss, but her contributions to spaceflight left a lasting impact. As more women joined NASA's astronaut corps, they proved themselves in roles that had once been exclusively male-dominated. Eileen Collins, a former military test pilot, became the first woman to pilot a space shuttle in 1995, and later, the first woman to command a shuttle mission in 1999. Her journey was a testament to the perseverance of the women who had fought for inclusion decades earlier. Beyond NASA, other nations and space agencies began to follow suit. In 1996, Claudie Haigneray became the first French woman in space. In 2001, Anousheh Ansari became the first female space tourist, proving that private individuals could also reach the stars. By the 21st century, female astronauts had become a regular part of space missions, working on the International Space Station and even preparing for future deep space exploration. One of the most significant milestones came in 2019, when NASA, astronauts Christina Koch and Jessica Meir conducted the first all-female spacewalk, something that had once been deemed impossible. Their mission was a powerful symbol of how far women had come in the space industry, but it also served as a reminder of the long battle for inclusion. Today, as humanity sets its sights on Mars and beyond, women are at the forefront of space exploration. NASA's Artemis program aims to put the first woman on the moon, acknowledging that the future of space travel must be diverse. Scientists, engineers, and astronauts, many of them women, are working together to push the boundaries of human exploration. The untold history of women in early space programs is not just a story of exclusion, it's a story of resilience, brilliance, and an unwavering belief in the right to explore. From the forgotten female computers of NASA to the Mercury 13 pilots who were denied their chance, from Valentina Tereshkova's groundbreaking flight to Sally Ride's historic journey, women have always been essential to space exploration. They may have been overlooked, but they were never absent. As we look toward the future, their legacy serves as a reminder. Space belongs to everyone. The next generation of astronauts, engineers, and scientists, regardless of gender, will build on the foundation laid by these pioneers. And perhaps, one day soon, the first human to step foot on Mars will be a woman.